Imagine a village. Ordinary. Quiet. Children running through yards. People waking at dawn. Now imagine that in 2 days, it will no longer exist. Not because of bombing, not because of a front line, but because of a decision. On March 1st to 2nd, 1943, one Ukrainian village was methodically destroyed. Thousands of civilians. This is not a fictional story. This is not a movie script. The world barely knows this name, Koriukivka. And today, you will hear the voice of someone who miraculously survived. History does not always scream. Sometimes it speaks very quietly. In northern Ukraine, among the forests of the Chernihiv region, stood Koriukivka, at that time a large village, alive, filled with voices, work, everyday life. It was not a strategic fortress. It was not an industrial center. It had no military value. It had people. When Nazi Germany occupied these territories in 1941, war did not arrive as a battle. It arrived as a presence. It settled in homes, in orders, in fear. Occupation changes the rhythm of life. Doors close earlier. Conversations grow shorter. People learn not to look soldiers in the eye. Soviet partisan units were active in the forests of the Chernihiv region. The forests became their shield and their refuge. They attacked garrisons, blew up railways, destroyed communication lines. The war was happening nearby. Koriukivka found itself between two forces. Partisans came from the forest. They asked for food, information, help. Sometimes simply a place to sleep. The occupation authorities demanded obedience, control, loyalty. The villagers did not choose sides in global politics. They were trying to survive the winter. But under occupation, simply living near partisans was already considered guilt. In February 1943, a partisan unit attacked the German garrison in Koriukivka. Some prisoners were freed. The garrison suffered losses. It was a military operation. But the response would not be military. In the punitive system of the Third Reich, there was a principle. Fear is more effective than a bullet. Punishment must be public, massive, so that neighboring villages would speak of it and be afraid. The decision was made quickly, not in a square, not in front of people, but in offices where a village is only a name on paper. Koriukivka became an example. In late February 1943, punitive units began to gather around the village. These were well-armed formations with experience in suppressing resistance. They knew the algorithm. They knew the sequence of actions. They knew how to erase a settlement. In documents, it was called an anti-partisan operation. But in reality, it was something else. The most terrifying part was the absence of chaos. Everything happened methodically. On March 1st, 1943, what would later become one of the largest punitive massacres of civilians in Europe during World War II began. Residents were gathered under the pretext of checking documents. People were driven into buildings. Houses were set on fire. There was no front line, no artillery, only a village and a system that decided to destroy it. For 2 days, Koriukivka was turning into ashes. The exact number of victims is still being clarified by historians, but it concerns thousands of civilians, more than in many well-known European wartime tragedies. And yet the world rarely speaks about it. Perhaps because it was a village, perhaps because almost no one was left to tell. But someone survived. Someone saw familiar streets fill with smoke. Someone heard the sound of life disappear. Someone lived through days when even the silence after gunfire felt unnatural. This story is not about a battle, not about strategy, not about heroism. It is a story about a mechanism of fear, about how war turns civilians into an example, about how one decision can erase thousands of names. Now you will hear the memory of a person who was there. And when she speaks, remember, behind every number stands a voice. And as long as that voice is heard, Koriukivka does not disappear a second time. Testimony of Raisa Mykolaivna Dushko, born 1928.
I lived on the outskirts of the village. On the morning of March 1st, I saw a chain of soldiers near the forest. They were wearing black uniforms and caps with swastikas. My brother Mykola ran in and shouted, "Get ready! They're shooting people!" We saw a neighboring house burning. Mother grabbed a sack and threw a knife and some bread into it. I jumped into my boots without stockings and ran out of the house with my family into the garden. We waited to see what would happen. Mother asked, "Children, is the house burning?" "No, Mama, it's not," we answered. "Kolya, let the cow out of the shed," Mother said. He ran and drove the cow out. Not far away, we saw a group of neighbors. I said, "Mama, let's go to them." And we went across the gardens onto Kolhospna Street, where frightened villagers had gathered. To this day, I cannot forgive myself for suggesting that. As we approached, 2 Germans appeared. They drove our group somewhere, threatening us with submachine guns. Then 2 more appeared. By then we understood we should run, but it was too late. They forced about 20 of us into the Kuzmenko family's house. A German came in. His eyes were bulging, bloodshot. He ordered everyone to lie down. My mother did not lie down. He killed her first. Old Mrs. Kuzmenko came up to him with an icon and began walking around him, praying. He watched her, and then he started shooting. I instantly threw myself under the bed, my head against the wall, my legs sticking out from under the blanket. The shooting stopped. The German left. Then a small child, about 4 or 5 years old, said, "Vasya, let's go home." He heard her. He came back into the house and shot the girl. I lay there quietly. In my mind, I said, "Lord, if you exist, leave me alive." Then I heard a 7-year-old girl, Nina, crawl out from behind a chest and say, "Uncle, please save me." It was as if the German had been waiting for someone to move. He came back in and shot her too. I lay still. Then I heard the quiet voice of old Mrs. Kuzmenko. "Call out, whoever is alive." I answered softly, "Where are you?" "Under the bed." "Are you wounded?" "No." "You don't feel it yet. We must hide." There was a small cellar in the house. I opened the hatch, and somehow we squeezed inside. I barely managed to close it. The lid was very heavy. We sat there, and blood was dripping down onto us. Then we began to smell smoke. "It's us, child. We're already burning," the 70-year-old grandmother said. I tried to open the hatch, but had no strength to lift it. Finally, I managed to push it up with my head. I pulled the grandmother out. The flames had already reached the entryway and the doors. I kicked out the window frame. Somehow, I dragged the wounded grandmother through the window. As soon as we got outside, the house burst into flames like a torch. The grandmother lived a little longer, but died from her wounds. I ran to Pionerska Street, to the pond. About 100 people had gathered there. I ran up and shouted, "Save yourselves! The Germans are shooting people!" A local policeman named Afanya was standing there, calming everyone. "Don't listen to her. She doesn't understand anything. They're burning partisan families." And people believed him. I ran toward Kirova Street. I saw people fleeing into the swamp. I followed them. Many people gathered there. I was crying. I was cold, frozen, soaked. My boots were wet through. A woman came up to me, hugged me, and took me with her. We stood in the swamp at night, watching the glow of the fire. We heard harmonicas playing in the center of the village. We heard singing, drunken laughter of those who were burning the houses. At 3 a.m, the Germans fired green signal flares. One man had a watch and noted the time. He said they were probably leaving. With others, I went to Beshkivka. In High, we all stopped and caught our breath. We were alive. From all the running, I had rubbed my feet raw and got blisters. I was left at Grandpa Yemitz's house. That is how I survived.
Testimony of Volodymyr Markovych Lytvyn, born 1929.
I said to my mother, "Let's go back to the village." I remember her answer very well. "Leave the living and go looking for the dead?" She meant she could not bring herself to leave the cow, the calf, and everything else without care. Still, she pushed a pillow under the stove and placed the things we might need there. In the cellar, she hid a sack of clothes. On the morning of March 1st, we saw the outskirts of the village burning. Someone said they were burning the homes of partisan families. Then I saw a truck driving down our street. One German was walking beside it while another, carrying a submachine gun, was entering every yard. In our house, 3 families had gathered, 7 people in total. Me, my mother and my 5-year-old little brother, Uncle Fedor, our neighbor Lyudmila Drailing with her son Alexander, and my friend Serhiy Moiseyenko. When the German soldier entered the house, everyone understood that this was the end. People began moving in panic, raising their hands and shouting, "We don't know anything! We're not guilty!" The fascist shouted something angrily and started spraying us with bullets. I slipped behind the partition between the stove and the heater. That is what saved me. That day they did not burn our street. I spent the night hiding in the cellar, and then I fled to the village of Lupasovo, to my aunt. On March 7th, I returned to Koriukivka. I buried my relatives and neighbors in a grave on the burned-out site. Under the stove, I found my mother's belongings, burned and reduced to ashes.
Testimony of Hanna Tymofiivna Kuzub, born 1929.
On March 1st, when shooting began in Koriukivka, I gathered with my mother, my little sister Valya, my brother Volodymyr, and my grandmother Fenya in the house of our neighbor, Uncle Petro Minenko, who lived across the street from us. 14 people had gathered there, 10 of them children. We did not even have time to ask our neighbor what was happening when an SS soldier entered the house. He was wearing a black uniform with a swastika and a skull on his cap. He shouted something in German and ordered everyone to lie down on the floor. Then he began firing his automatic weapon at the people lying there. I froze as if turned to stone. A moment later, I came to my senses, and together with 9-year-old Valya Minyenko, we crawled under the bed. The bed was covered with a blanket that hung low to the floor. Under it, there were potatoes stored there, and when we moved, they began rolling out. The German finished shooting, then walked over to the bed. He lifted the edge of the blanket and began firing again. I remember seeing his terrible eyes, red and bloodshot. Then I lost consciousness. When I came to, I lay there silently until it began to grow dark. Valya helped me crawl out from under the bed, our hiding place. What I saw was horrifying. Everyone lay motionless. Only the dead children, Natalochka and Volodya, were still sitting where they had been when the shooting began. We decided to hide in Valya's cellar. Using pieces of cloth, we bandaged my wounds. My arm had been shot through, my hand shattered, and 2 more bullets had grazed my back. Sometime before dawn, little Valentina wanted to go to her relatives on the outskirts of Klin, but I persuaded her not to. People there had already begun to be killed and houses burned. She listened to me and ran to relatives in Okramievichi through the village of Vysoka. I stayed in the cellar alone. I had lost too much blood and could not walk. My legs would not hold me. In the morning, I heard someone scratching at the cellar door. At first, I thought it was a German soldier, but it was a boy, Mikhailo Derevianko, who lived on Shevchenko Street. I was horrified when I saw him. He was completely dark with dried blood. Only his eyes were shining. He told me that he had crawled out from under the bodies in a restaurant where several hundred people had been gathered and shot. A machine gun had been placed on the counter, and it fired without stopping. Mikhailo had been holding his little sister in his arms when a bullet struck her. He fell with her and lost consciousness. He woke up at night. A woman named Olha Pavlivna Horbachevska, who was badly wounded, helped him crawl out from under the bodies. We stayed hidden in that cellar for 5 days. On March 5th, Omelian Minyenko came and began mourning for his burned family. That was when we called out to him and told him that his daughter Valya had survived. I begged him to take me with him. In the village of Lebid, nobody wanted to take in a wounded girl. Finally, the village elder, Pilip Stetsko, took pity on me. A few days later, partisans arrived in the village. They wanted to arrest the elder and shoot him as a collaborator. I cried out, "Don't take him! He saved me! I'm from Koriukivka. He will help you." In that way, he saved my life, and I saved his. About 2 months later, I went to the village of Sakutivka to my aunt. There I was treated by a doctor from Koriukivka, Pavlo Sushinsky, because my wounds had become infected. In the knitted scarf I had been wearing during the shooting, he counted 33 bullet holes in 4 or 5 rows. He kept wondering how none of those bullets had passed through me.
The fires eventually burned out. The shooting stopped. The soldiers left. And the silence that remained was heavier than the gunfire. For 2 days, an entire community had been erased. Not in battle, not on a battlefield, but in homes, in kitchens, in cellars where people believed they might survive the night. When the smoke finally cleared, Koriukivka was no longer a village. It was ash. Historians estimate that around 7,000 civilians were killed during those days of March 1943. Men, women, children. It became one of the largest massacres of civilians in Europe during World War II. And yet, outside Ukraine, the name is almost unknown. There are no famous films about it, no widely known memorial days, just testimonies, voices that survived when entire families did not. People like Raisa, Volodymyr, and Hanna, children who hid under beds, in cellars, under the bodies of the dead. Children who grew up carrying memories that no child should ever have. History is often written in numbers, but numbers are quiet. Voices are not. And every time one of these stories is told, the village that was meant to disappear returns for a moment. Because memory does something fire cannot. It rebuilds what was burned. And as long as these voices are heard, Koriukivka will not disappear again. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. The tragedy of Koriukivka is one of the darkest and least known massacres of civilians during World War II. Thousands of people, families, children, entire streets of neighbors were erased in just a few days. For many years, their voices were almost forgotten. But every time someone listens to these testimonies, the silence that followed those fires becomes a little weaker. If this story moved you, please consider leaving a like. It helps this video reach more people. Share this story so the memory of what happened in Koriukivka is not lost again. And subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more real stories from history. Stories that should never disappear. Because sometimes the most terrifying stories are not legends. They are history.